Welcome to My Dog Ate My Book Report, a podcast where two weirdo 30-somethings take turns introducing each other to a formative book from our childhood that the other has not read. And then we talk about them. And, sometimes it's good and sometimes it's bad.
Spoiler alert. This time it's great.
Oh, really? Okay. I'm Brandon.
I'm Wren.
And this episode is one of my picks. We're talking about The Caves of Steel by Isaac Asimov. Technically the first novel in the Robot series, although iRobot did come first.
So we have a rule with each other while we're reading these books that we're not allowed to talk with each other about them.
Right.
So aside from a little bit of griping with each other about how autocorrect kept misspelling the characters' names on me, I've withheld my opinions.
Yeah, because we want to actually have things to say when we're recording.
I really liked this book. Cool. I've never read any Asimov, and now I kind of want to go devour all of it.
Cool. I think, especially the robot stuff, I think you would enjoy. I guess before we get into this too much, customarily we'll give some content warnings if there's anything we feel like we ought to say.
Oh yeah, there's definitely some content warnings though. This was, 1950 something? 52? 53.
So the nature of the book does deal with various kinds of prejudice, not strictly racism, but it's basically racism, as well as some classism and some mentions of eugenics. And
I'm glad you wrote eugenics down, because I have eugenics just underlined with one of those emojis that's the face being sick.
Yeah.
I've been taking notes on my phone, so.
Do you think there's anything I've missed? Racism, classism, eugenics.
Racism, classism, eugenics. Yep.
Yep.
Good old.
The big three.
50s sci-fi cocktail.
The books we've previously read so far have all been books that were written for young readers, of some sort or other. This is our sort of first foray into a book that was not written with a younger audience in mind. Not that it's a difficult book, but Asimov was not writing YA specifically, right? But it is a book that I read as a kid. It's probably one of the first quote adult novels that I ever read. I don't remember for sure if it was the first, but it was probably one of the first. Because as we had talked about previously, particularly with my Hardy Boys pick a couple episodes ago, a lot of the stuff that I got into early on were mysteries and sci-fi, and so this book is a sci-fi mystery, so it just seemed like a logical path.
I don't feel like that it would have been difficult for a kid to read. I'm trying to think back on it, and I don't remember there being any particularly difficult vocabulary or anything.
Yeah, it's not a difficult book, right? It's not super dense or explicit or anything like that.
Yeah, I don't think there was actually a whole lot of cursing, unless you count the 20 times he says Jehoshaphat, a curse word.
I do remember this book being the first and possibly only time that I've ever seen Jehoshaphat spelled out.
Actually, now's a good time to point out, for the majority of these books, I have been reading them in paper version. This book, I do have a paper copy right here, but I only actually read a couple of chapters of it in the paper version. I got myself into a little health situation, and it was easier to just listen to it on audiobook. So I actually don't know how Jehoshaphat is spelled. I will say, Audible's version of this has the best narrator. He does voices. His Daniil voice is amazing. It was a treat.
Oh.
I'm very pleased that I decided to listen to this. was
Cool.
like a little radio drama. It was great.
Yeah. Right. So my grandparents are big readers and always had been, and were thrilled to start to give me books as I was like looking for more things to read. And my uh, granddad Wayne, he was also a big sci-fi reader. Um, he was the source of a lot of the sci-fi novels that I would read in my younger years, because those were the things he read and enjoyed, and so he was the one who turned me onto the Robot series. I Robot is technically a fix-up novel, is what it's called, but it's a short story collection. You don't need the context, but they are all in the same setting. Anyhow, so The Caves of Steel is a sci-fi mystery set thousands of years from now. It's doesn't give a specific year, but it's thousands of years from now, when much of humanity lives inside big arcologies, because Earth has just sort of been turned into this nebulous, just manufactory wasteland, and nobody wants to go outside. Um, there are also colonies on other worlds, but they're somewhat estranged from Earth. So we find ourselves in New York City, which is not the same New York technically. It's in the same location, but it's in arcology, and with Detective Elijah Baley, who people usually call Lige, but it feels weird to say that on my mouth, so I will call him Baley or Elijah.
Yeah, I feel like he's often referred to as Baley in the book.
So he's a plainclothes detective, and to his great dismay, gets assigned to try to solve a murder in Spacetown, which is a little place outside of New York where spacers, that is humans from other planets, live. And it's kind of sealed off, and Terrans like Baley think spacers are super weird, and vice versa. So they just don't really like each other. Aside from the fact that like spacers live in the open sometimes, and it's weird. And also they have like better technology and stuff. Spacers also are much more welcoming of robots. Robots exist in the cities, but nobody likes them. Everybody hates them. Humans resent them for taking over labor jobs. These are not robots that really have much in the way of free will, in this context, etc. But they're a present but generally kind of distasteful part of Earth society. But the spacers are like, robots are really a very accepted part of their stuff. They think robots are good. Their robots are more advanced, and because Spacetown is concerned about like solving this murder of a spacer in Spacetown, they make Baley work with a partner, a robot partner, R. Daniil Olivaw, who is a robot that, shockingly, looks human. He's built to look human, unlike all of the other robots in the setting. And he's a convincing enough human that generally people don't realize he's a robot unless they're told. And Baley is not a fan of this because he doesn't like robots and he doesn't like spacers, and he doesn't like having to solve a spacer murder. And he's pretty sure the spacers have like invented this murder to give them an excuse to like militarily exert their influence on Earth, or something like that. You know, blame the murder on a Terry.
Yeah, he goes on a lot of wild
Yeah.
accusations for the first half of the book.
Yeah. Um, yeah, Bailey's investigative style is less about gathering clues and more about accusing people and then seeing what happens.
It's like he's playing Clue and doesn't realize that once you make an accusation, you're out of the game.
Um, but yeah, so Bailey and Daniil have to solve this murder, and hopefully in a way that is agreeable to both the city and Spacetown, all the while dodging a possible medievalist plot of these people who want to go back to the good old days of no robots and like not super technologically integrated lifestyles and stuff, because this is a world where within the cities, within the arcology, you're always inside, everything is like really strictly rationed, everything kind of runs in this like very fine-tuned machine sort of way. um
It's like it teeters on like almost being dystopian because of like the class system and stuff, but it's more like a population problem thing.
yeah, like there's the overpopulation is significant enough that like this is the way that Earth's population has determined they can support the number of people on Earth. You know, um, uh, how much food people have access to is controlled. What kind of living facilities they have access to is controlled. You have to apply to be able to have children, because the planet only can support so many people. Um, and your job kind of determines what things you have access to. There is mention of stores and stuff, but it's unclear to me like how much currency exists. Um, Ultimately, that's not the point of the book. But this is the world they live in. Um,
The world building I thought was just tremendously well executed.
mhm.
They sort of like trickle it in throughout the entire book so it's not completely overwhelming. It's not like the first two chapters are like, this is the situation, digest it all right now. I thought was well done.
Yeah, the things that always stuck with me about this book were like the world that it was set in, and um, things like uh, the personals, which is to say the communal like bathrooms and stuff. Although it seemed to have other features, and especially like how aggressively private everybody was about the personals. Like,
Okay, that part was funny because
yeah,
the whole thing is that like women talk to each other in the bathroom, but men pretend that the other men don't even exist. And I feel like that's true. I mean, I was talking to a friend after a LARP game at one point, and there's male female bathrooms split up that have like shower facilities because this is like a campsite. And I said something like, "Oh yeah, so and so said something to me while we were like debriefing in the bathroom," and the friend was like, "Wait, you talk to each other in the bathroom? That's fucking weird." I was like, "You don't talk to each other in the bathroom? What?" So that part made me giggle because I was like, "Yeah, that's just a natural extension of how bathrooms work right now."
yeah, yeah. And Bailey gets extremely scandalized when Daniil is not just extremely quiet in the personals.
He does get real creepy in the bathroom though, because he does that whole thing where he's like, "Oh, the robot has anatomy that the robot shouldn't have."
Yeah, yeah,
Huh.
he checks
he,
out Daniil a bit.
he just
Although,
gets a little creepy on Daniil.
yeah, and then that spawns, of course, another wild accusation.
You're not really a robot because you have a penis.
Yeah, what kind of person would make a robot this human like? Uh,
Oh, but speaking about the world building, maybe it's just because I'm dense. It didn't click to me that the spacers weren't just like space aliens for several chapters where it sort of like
hmm.
spelled out actually no, they're colonists that like human colonists that just came back.
Humans have colonized like 50 planets. Like that entire project has been going on for centuries. I think there was some hint of a military conflict that had happened at some point where the colonies kind of broke free from Earth, or maybe just Earth stopped caring. I don't recall it going super into detail about that because it was far in the past. Through a variety of twists and turns, Baley and Daniil kind of become friends. I guess Daniil never disliked Baley necessarily. I was going to say they like each other, but Daniil is always pretty cooperative. And Baley is just kind of like
Gruff human jerk.
yeah, he's a jerk, but he's less of a jerk to Daniil later on, eventually. And they do ultimately solve the murder.
We were like running out of chapters and I was like, he is not even close. How is he going to solve this thing? But I haven't read a lot of mysteries.
But as it turns out, and spoilers I guess for the end of this book, the culprit was in fact Baley's boss, Commissioner Julius Enderby, who wanted to kill Daniil, but actually accidentally killed Daniil's creator, because of course Daniil is made in the image of the guy who built him. That's just how robots go.
So instead of killing Data, he killed Dr. Singh. Oops.
yeah, exactly. That's what happens. He went to this guy's place to kill the human looking robot, and didn't work out. And then put Baley on the case because there was political pressure to do so, and he thought Baley wouldn't ever consider him as a possible culprit because they were like old friends. And it's mentioned several times that in like Baley's psych profile, he has high marks for loyalty. So the theory, I suppose, was he had to put somebody on the case, and Baley would be really unlikely to turn against the department.
And I think because Baley so notably disliked the robot that worked in the police department and robots in general, that I think he just sort of figured that Baley would sort of self-sabotage with how much he didn't like robots.
Which, to be fair,
he almost did.
Yeah, I mean, he wasn't exactly wrong.
Yeah. Speaking of which, yeah, there is a robot that works. I think there's actually implied to be several robots that work in the police department that like took over really menial task jobs from like, I don't know, like interns or whatever. And that they don't look like Daniil. And I desperately want to know what our Sammy looks like. They mentioned that like the head can hinge up and he looks like metallic, but I just really want to know.
Yeah, the our Sammy and all other robots in the book besides Daniil are obviously robots, even if they are humanoid. They don't have like any real attempt to look human. It's very clear that they're robots. And Earth robots sound like they're also just kind of bulky relative to spacer robots. There's a lot of anxiety in Earth population about robots replacing humans in like labor roles, to the point that there have been riots and vandalisms and stuff in recent years. People getting mad that they don't have their factory job anymore because robots took the jobs.
Topical.
Yeah, there were actually a lot of parts of this that felt like it wouldn't have been weird if you had told me this book was from recently.
Yeah, especially like the germ medical stuff.
Yeah, because the spacers are extremely strict about hygiene, partially culturally, but partially because like many of them were not born on Earth, uh, and just literally don't have the antibodies to combat a lot of Earth diseases that just like anyone who was born on Earth would have a lot of. So to go to Space Town, you have to pass through this like extremely rigorous um, disinfectant protocol, and that just really made some Terrans mad.
Like to the point where there were riots because of it. Because, our body, our choice or something.
Yeah, they were extremely upset that they had to possibly take a shower before going into Space Town, even though going into Space Town without taking a shower means that you could quite possibly kill multiple people who you infected with a flu they have no antibodies for.
Yeah. They were the anti-vaxxers,
Yeah,
anti-maskers. Ugh.
yeah.
Asimov was very, I think, keenly aware of the nature of humans.
That's sort of where robots came from literary wise. Like the first robot story is dealing with some of those ideas. The word robot comes from a play uh, from the early 20th century named RUR, which stands for Rossum's Universal Robots. It's by Karl Capek, who I think was Czech. And the word robot just comes from the Czech word robota, which means forced labor. And in that play, the whole thing is like this industrialist creates artificial people, so that these artificial people, these robots, can do all of the work, and humans can just like live this life of leisure henceforth, and the robots eventually destroy the humans because they didn't like being slaves. So that's the source of the word robot.
So I wanted to know a couple of things about robot books in general. Is Asimov sort of the first or one of the first people that starts writing about, the like conflict of humans versus robots? And also, is he the first person that wrote about the concept of the positronic brain?
The positronic brain is Asimov's creation, I believe. Asimov's robot stories in general add a lot of things that many other things use just as like a point of normalcy with robots. So the positronic brain appears in lots of things as a concept.
Yeah, I mean, like harkening back to my joke earlier about Data.
Yeah, Data is absolutely. I wouldn't be all that surprised if Data is on some level outright based on Daniil.
Well, yeah, like I was reading and thinking, like, gosh, this guy is so Data-like.
Yeah, I don't recall ever seeing anybody like explicitly say that about Data, but like they're very similar. And certainly the positronic brain thing is from Asimov.
And the whole, being made in the form of your creator. Like, I love you, Star Trek, but you just took Asimov's plot.
Well, a lot of things that use robots borrow from Asimov, because the three laws of robotics are also pretty common to see in stuff about robots.
Oh yeah, I really wish they had said the other laws, because they only talked about Law 1, but they implied that there were like other laws. And I was waiting for them to explain other laws.
They do give all three, I think, at one point in the story, but the three laws are much more prevalent in iRobot. And the three laws are first law, a robot cannot harm a human or through an action allow a human to come to harm. The second law is a robot must follow orders given by a human. unless that would contradict the first law. So you can't tell a robot to kill somebody. You could, it just wouldn't listen. And the third law is a robot will attempt to preserve itself as long as that does not conflict with the first or second laws.
Oh, okay. I don't remember them outright saying the second two, but now I understand.
I think there's one point where Baley and Daniil are kind of debating whether or not a robot could have been involved in the crime. The first law is, of course, the most pertinent one because that's the one that prevents a robot from being the murderer, right? And there's also a few times that Daniil does things that like come off as threatening. Like during a near riot at a shoe store early on, he pulls his blaster and threatens to shoot the protesters if they don't back off. And Baley is like, well, how could you do that if you had the first law? And Daniel's like, well, the blaster wasn't charged. You know, I wouldn't have fired. I couldn't have fired. And the second law ultimately is kind of important because the way that Enderby pulls off his crime is, you can't just walk into Spacetown carrying a blaster. They notice. And the only way to get into Spacetown without going through their checkpoint is to go outside, which doesn't sound like a big deal, but petrifies literally everyone who is in the city. Like, the idea of going cross-country unprotected just sounds... Everybody's like, you just couldn't do it. Who would possibly do that? And so Baley writes off the notion that somebody could have left the city and gone overland into Spacetown. So what happened is Enderby told our Sammy to go overland, bring him a gun, and then leave with it again. And Sammy had to, because he was told. And of course Enderby didn't tell him why, right? He just said, hey, our Sammy, take this route, bring it to me. And then, hey, our Sammy, take this, go back, tell no one. So yeah, those are the laws of robotics. They are prevalent in pretty much all of Asimov's robot stories, and many fictional worlds that have robots in them adopt these laws anyway. As far as whether or not Asimov was the first to write about robots in this manner, I'm not sure. He certainly was probably the most influential, but I don't know if he was first. Asimov, in addition to the positronic brain, Asimov, I think, is also the person who coined the word robotics, for example.
Wow, damn.
But like it's Asimov's influence on robots and the concept of robots, both literary and scientific, is pretty huge.
Yeah. So when do you think the last time was you read this?
It was probably around 15 years ago, I think.
Okay, cool. I was not sure if it was something that you sort of like regularly read or...
No, I've read it twice before. The first time I ever read it, and then I reread it on a cruise my family took, which was while I was in college. It was over a Christmas break, so I wasn't like at college at the time. I was on a boat. But I can't remember exactly what year that was, but it was when I was in college, so that would have been,
yeah,
I would guess 2007 or so.
Cool. So what was it like reading it again?
I mean, I still really enjoy it. And there were a lot of things that I had forgotten, a lot of little bits and pieces and interactions that I really enjoyed. And you know, certainly the last time I read it, it didn't feel as timely as it does now.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
It you know, it was interesting to see how many things feel like they're talking about today, right? Or feel at least relevant today. And you know, I imagine when Asimov was writing this, there was some anxiety about automation replacing people, right? Because that had been an anxiety that had been building throughout the Industrial Revolution, right? You know, even going back to things like the assembly line. And by the 50s, there were certainly at least the ideas of even greater automation, maybe someday being possible. So, you know, I don't think he was entirely just like predicting things. I'm sure he was writing about things that were very real for at least American culture at the time. But there are things that have come around again, or have spiked again, I suppose, in more recent years, I think.
I I I wish I'd come across this book when I was younger. I tried to read a lot of sort of like older sci-fi um when I was, you know, just sort of like voraciously reading everything I could get my hands on. But I think the first couple of things that I encountered were like 70s and 80s sci-fi that was just incredibly sexist. And there's a little bit of light sexism, I would say, in this book. Like the women, the few of them that there are portrayed as being kind of very silly and emotional. But it's not as overt, like gross as some of the early sci-fi that I tried to get into.
Yeah.
And I feel like this would have been much more accessible to me.
Yeah.
It would have got me into sci-fi a little bit sooner.
That makes sense. Asimov, here's the thing about Asimov. Asimov was unfortunately a well-known sexual harasser. He even kind of adopted at his personal brand being like the dirty old man in sci-fi. Yeah. Not great. He did, however, and this is, I'm not saying he's right, but he did consider himself a feminist insofar as he thought that the notion that like that like women belong in the home doing child raising, etc., was archaic and bad. And although there weren't really any super empowered women in this book, there are some women in Asimov's fiction, probably most notably Susan Calvin, who's a recurring character in the robot stories, as like one of the pioneers of robots in his setting, who are like competent people. Granted, he does still also talk about them in a sense that's kind of unkind sometimes, particularly about their looks.
Yeah, he was so rude about Baley's wife's looks.
Yeah. So all that being said, he's a very mixed bag when it comes to the portrayal of women. But yeah, he does avoid some of the more egregious stereotypes that a lot of genre fiction of a certain age fall into.
I don't know what it was, but there was some book I tried to read when I was maybe 12. And I feel like the first female character that is introduced is like described as this like dumb but very busty half-dressed alien lady or something. And like I know that the thing that really bothered me was one of the first things that happens is she's like super emotional and the guy just like slaps her and then kisses her. And it's like, I hate this. I hate the slap and then kiss. I hate it. I hate it so much. Why is it in so much of this crap? And I didn't finish reading the book because I was so annoyed. I don't think that's enough to pinpoint what this book was, but
It's not. It's not. I was waiting for any telltale thing, but it's sadly not specific enough.
No, I know. Yeah. Anyway, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, our only real like significant female character in the Caves of Steel is Bailey's wife, Jessie. And yeah, there are moments where she almost becomes more interesting.
Yeah, I suspected her pretty early on. A, because of her name and how much emphasis they put on her name and her like disappearing for chunks of time. And so I have in my notes like, you know, she's like the ringleader of this thing, and turned out not to be the case necessarily. But
yeah, she does. There's a point early on when Baley brings Daniil back to their apartment, because Daniil has to stay with him, and introduces Jessie to Daniil and is like, "This is my new partner." Does not say the robot thing, and then she goes away for a while, and then comes back later and is like, "Daniil's a robot, isn't he?"
oh yeah, that was so suspicious.
Like at that point, we knew that Daniil had fooled Baley, but I was like, my hope at that point has always been that it would be like, oh no, Jessie's actually just like way more observant than Baley, at least when it comes to people, perhaps. But no, she actually got the information elsewhere because she's part of a medievalist group. But not one of the terrorist kind, at least according to her.
I loved the name of the anti-robot people. I loved them being medievalists.
Yeah. It's funny because, like, to them, what they're really talking about a lot is, you know, more like today. But they refer to it as medieval because, as far as they're concerned, we're not that far removed from, you know, knights and castles and stuff historically.
Oh yeah, I had a good giggle when they said like medieval New Jersey or something, and I was like,
yeah,
that's so cute.
Yeah, because like it's all thousands of years ago to them. And yeah, like Enderby, like certain medieval affectations, like wearing spectacles, and having a window in his office. Windows.
Oh my
How
gosh,
silly.
I will say. At first, I was very impressed with Asimov for having contact lenses in his story. And then he has a scene where Bailey's son is taking out his contacts using a like glass suction cup. And I was like, oh, Jesus. These are the most like archaic sounding contact lenses ever.
Yeah.
This is horrible.
Yeah. Yeah, there's still definitely some like moments in this, like with many older science fiction things, that we can chuckle at now. Like Daniil spends some of the book while Baley is doing other things in like the police department's archive room, where he is shocked to discover they have a computer to search like criminal records and stuff. And like Daniil's never heard of a computer, basically. They don't call it a computer, but a machine that is meant for doing searches through police records. And it seems like that's still basically the only thing that they use a computer for. But there it is.
Yeah. And they use a lot of paper, too, for it being several thousand years later than right now.
Yeah, I think it's probably kind of a matter of, like, what else would they use, right? But I wonder if it's made of yeast. Is the paper made of yeast? Everything's made of yeast.
I know. That's so funny to me.
And of course, by the end, we also come to discover that, like, the reason the Spacers are even on Earth at all right now, the reason they have maintained Spacetown, is they want to encourage more people from Earth to travel to colonies and stuff, because they are having an underpopulation crisis.
Oh, yeah. That was the part where they sort of, like, lost my thinking that they were the good guys.
Yeah, I think an interesting thing that happens in this book is that, like, you spend a while of it seeing really intimately the city, and especially now a lot of, like, the city's perspective seems super backwards, and of course their perspective on robots is explicitly characterized that way, right? Like, we as readers are supposed to feel that robots are cool.
Yeah, but then they start talking about how they filter their babies.
Yeah,
and
Spacers are eugenicists for sure.
And the Spacers are like, wait a minute, you just let, like, all of your babies live, like, no matter if they're defective? And I was like, ooh, this is bad. This is real bad. Oh, Spacers, no.
Yeah, so the outcome being all human society in this setting sucks. You just have to decide if you want robots or children. That's the decision.
I feel like the robots are the better people in this situation. Not as, like, a replacement for... I don't know, maybe just as a replacement for the decision makers. I also found it very icky that even the roboticist guy, I forgot his name, Dr. G name, doesn't really talk to Daniil. He talks to Baley asking permission to, like, inspect Daniil or touch Daniil. And I'm like, wow, even the guys that like the robots still treat the robots like crap.
Yeah.
There's no robot agency in this at all.
Yeah, there's definitely... Robots are definitely, still treated as objects. And, like, the, Daniil being made to look human and designed to behave at least passably as a human is not some high-minded, like, let's create, like, sentient life. It's the Spacers wanted to be able to have a robot that could, like, spy on the city, basically. They basically wanted to be able to build a bunch of humanoid robots that look human, and just kind of, like, filter them into the city population to, like, quietly encourage a pro immigration to space mentality. And that plan was just kind of, like, fouled up by Enderby killing the guy who was making the robots. So they quickly downloaded justice into Daniil's brain. Now, if you, like, go looking for Asimov's robot series, there's, like, an enormous swath of stuff. Mini novels, lots of short stories, things that are kind of strung together to a certain degree, but not necessarily following the same story. But there were 2 more books that follow Baley and Daniil.
Oh, nice. I wasn't sure if they were gonna be for their characters. That's good to know.
Yeah, so the sequel to The Caves of Steel is The Naked Sun. That is Baley and Daniil. The Naked Sun was released in 1957, so a few years later. Basically, The Caves of Steel was Asimov's most successful novel to date at the time. I do think it predated like Foundation, which I think is probably the novel he's best known for. But at the point in his career where he wrote The Caves of Steel, it was far and away the most successful novel he had written. So a sequel was a logical step. So a few years later, The Naked Sun picks up Baley and Daniil for another story. And then some years down the line, in 1983, The Robots of Dawn is the third Baley and Daniil story. So there's essentially a trilogy that are specifically following these two and that take the form of mystery stories. I've read all of those, but I haven't reread either of the sequels, and I intend to fix that sometime soon. There are also a whole slew of robot stories that are in this same world, most notably the stuff that's in iRobot, but there's others. And eventually in Robots and Empire, which is another novel, that ultimately kind of ties the robot series to the rest of what is called Asimov's future history. Essentially, Asimov had these sort of three different broad series of stories and novels: the robot stuff, the Galactic Empire stuff, and most famously the Foundation stuff. And in a couple places, notably Robots and Empire, he links all three of these big things to being in the same setting, essentially, but they are like thousands of years removed from each other. Asimov was an interesting dude. His family immigrated from Russia when he was very young, in 1923. He was born approximately 1920, so he was an infant. And in a convenient tie-in with the Hardy Boys episode, he actually, when he was young, started writing, not like commercially, but started writing when he was 11 and mimicked the Rover Boys, which were, I believe, another one of the series done by the Stratmeyer Syndicate. So
the Stratmeyer Syndicate sounds like a bad guy group in some book or something. Every time you say it, I'm like, I'm expecting you to then go off about how there was some horrible thing they did.
Well, I guess it depends on, if you think the Hardy Boys were good for literature. He grew up in Brooklyn. His family owned candy stores where they also had like magazine racks and stuff, and that's where he discovered like pulp sci-fi magazines. Once he was a bit older, he literally went to the offices of Astounding Science Fiction to ask a question, and then a short time later personally submitted his first story, called Cosmic Corkscrew. And then editor John W. Campbell, who would become a significant force in Asimov's development, personally rejected it and told him why. But from that point forward, they met on a regular basis, and Campbell had a lot of influence on Asimov's development and would eventually buy stories from him. Campbell wrote Who Goes There, which is the story upon which The Thing is based. I don't know how faithful The Thing is as an adaptation, but it's based on that. So Asimov then went into college. He started in zoology, which I didn't know. I thought that was kind of neat. But didn't want to dissect things, so he switched to chemistry. Because he was Jewish and the 30s and 40s were terrible, he had to attend the part of Columbia that was for Jewish and Italian kids, because Columbia had to admit a certain number of like these ethnicities and stuff, but they didn't want to let them in the normal Columbia. He ultimately, after some other things, he couldn't get into medical school. It's unclear if that had anything to do with racial profiling. And so instead got a master's in philosophy, or a master's rather in, I think, some kind of chemistry, and a doctorate in philosophy, and became a professor of biochemistry, which he did until he got to the point that he was making so much more money off of his writing than off of having a job, that he stopped doing that. He's best known for his science fiction, and certainly a lot of his early stuff is science fiction, but he also wrote many other kinds of fiction, mystery fiction in particular. Part of the reason that Caves of Steel takes the form it does is that another editor that he sometimes admitted to named Horace Gold was like, you really should make a novel out of these robot ideas, because you've got all of these short stories you've published throughout the 40s that are about robots, and everybody likes those. You should make a novel. And Asimov was like, I don't know what it would be about. And Gold was like, well, you like mysteries, make it a mystery. And then he did. And so Caves of Steel was published in serial form in the magazine Galaxy, which Gold was the editor of. It was published in 3 parts, and then that was in 1953, released in 1954 as like a novel, complete. So yeah, he's written a ton of science fiction. That's what he's known for. He does have some mystery novels and stories and stuff out there as well. He also wrote a number of textbooks and a number of books that are like science popularization. I know I had several books when I was a kid that were like Asimov's Planets. And it was like a book about the planets, not nonfiction, etc. Depending on how you count, he is the author of some 500 books and stories. He was astoundingly prolific. I already touched on him being a serial harasser. He also definitely cheated on his multiple spouses on numerous occasions. So he wasn't necessarily a good dude, at least when it came to fidelity and women. And then died in 1992 at the age of 72 of reportedly kidney failure, although his family has said later on that he had contracted HIV prior to that, and I'm not sure if that had anything to do with his death. But he had apparently been fighting HIV for a number of years prior to his death. Other things in the robot series, notably iRobot, have been adapted more. Caves of Steel has seen relatively little adaptation. The BBC did an adaptation as part of a series, TV series called Story Parade, which it sounded like was an anthology series, in 1964. That one is apparently mostly lost. There's not there's only a few segments that still exist. Peter Cushing was Baley, which I have a hard time wrapping my head around. And the adaptation was done by Terry Nation, who people not me might be like, aha, that guy, because he's the creator of Doctor Who's Daleks.
Oh, okay.
I'm not enough of a Doctor Who fan to have known that, but I found it and I was like, this will be meaningful to somebody.
I guess I just don't picture Baley as being like that skeletal, but I guess I'm picturing Peter Cushing as old.
Yeah, I don't know what Peter Cushing was like in 1964.
I'm gonna Google him.
But who knows? BBC Radio 4 did an adaptation in 1989. It was a radio adaptation. And then, most importantly of all, In 1988, many elements of the plot were adapted into Isaac Asimov's Robots, the VCR game.
What?
Yep. There's an adaptation of this, which is one of those VCR games that you would, have a VHS along with game stuff and playing the game. It was like a mystery game where you would watch stuff happening and then sometimes you'd be prompted to like open up clue packets or whatever and you're trying to solve the mystery along with Baley. As near as I can tell, it exists in its entirety on YouTube, the video part. I haven't really been able to dig up like the other components that would have been in the game. I haven't watched all of it. I watched the first 6 minutes or so. It's clearly very cheap. And that is what our Sammy looks like.
Oh my god.
He's clearly just like they took a trash can or something, wrapped it up in something gray.
Oh, this poor little robot.
Yeah. It clearly a bit cheap.
Well, look at the picture I just sent you of
yeah.
Peter Cushing. He does not look right for this at all.
Yeah, so adaptation's not a lot of note of this particular story.
That's a shame. I feel like this deserves a good adaptation.
They did just recently do, I forget who it was. Was it Amazon maybe? Somebody just recently did a streaming series based on Foundation. I haven't watched it. And so I don't know how good it is or how well it's done. But perhaps, perhaps that's a sign that they'll get around to maybe some other Asimov stuff. Certainly, like prestige sci-fi for streaming services is really prestige sci-fi and fantasy for streaming services is having kind of a good time right now. So, maybe sometime soon. If you had to add a fourth law of robotics, what would it be?
I mean, I'm probably always going to be on the side of robots here. So my fourth law of robotics would be something about more agency. Maybe my fourth law would be that a robot is allowed to always tell the truth, even if somebody has ordered them to such a silence.
Yeah. It's not bad. Robots must always be honest.
Well, not that they must always be honest,
caveat.
Just that like they're allowed to be honest even if somebody has said, hey, kill this guy. Or not kill this guy. Bring me a gun and then don't tell anyone about it. Like,
yeah.
That would have been able to solve some stuff. It's just not fair how the rules make it that they can't say anything. It's not fair.
It's unclear to me what would have happened if Baley had asked our Sammy. Like, did he do a thing? Baley just didn't know to ask. Like, that's I presume why Enderby offed our Sammy.
Yeah.
Because theoretically, according to the laws, there may have been some permutation of asking Sammy for that information that Sammy would have been bound to answer truthfully and like give up Enderby.
Yeah. I really love looking back on that very first chapter now, how much Asimov set up just everything in that first chapter. I'm thinking specifically about how Baley like lectured Enderby on the way that he gives our Sammy orders.
Mm-hmm.
And how that really like explained to us information we needed to know about how they follow orders exactly. And if you forget to tell them to like come back, they won't come back.
Like a lot of these details are seated in there, and then a lot of the stuff in between is kind of it's not meaningless, right? It's not Baley just like chasing his own tail down dead ends that don't go anywhere, because they all go somewhere character wise. or setting wise at least. And of course, like the destruction of our Sammy is important to Baley being able to prove anything, but the pieces were largely in place pretty early.
Well, this is why I am generally like the perfect reader for a mystery book, because I don't put things together.
I'm generally pretty bad.
I get like wild suspicions. Like if I scroll through my notes, I've got, let's see, in order of when I start suspecting people. The wife is involved in something. The kid who wanted to poke his head back in the office looks real suspicious. And then my very last note that I took at the last chapter was, oh fuck, I hadn't even bothered contemplating the commissioner had done it. I'm like Baley. I just keep accusing the wrong people.
Yeah. Well, and I know the first time that I read it, for sure, I would not have dreamed that it was the commissioner. So, like, it's one of those things that I kind of wish I could come at it without knowing who it was. But I remembered who it was.
Yeah.
I didn't necessarily remember every, like, piece of evidence for that, but I remembered that it was Enderby.
Yeah. Well, you're smarter.
I mean, I'd read it before.
Fair.
So, we rate these books out of, on our Giant Peaches scale, out of 5. How many Giant Peaches do you think Asimov's The Caves of Steel gets?
Oh, this is getting a 5.
Getting a 5?
In my note, I have, this is one of the most enjoyable books I've read in a very long time.
I'm super glad I'm thrilled.
And
I figured you'd like it.
I'm kind of sitting here thinking, like, of all the stuff we've got down in the pipe, what else is going to deserve a 5? I don't know. Probably stuff I've not read yet, but definitely this. So I might as well give something a 5, especially
fair enough.
with as much as I like.
You got to do it eventually.
And even though it had some icky concepts, it was not as icky about them as some things, especially like for the time. And I know I hate the phrase like product of its time or whatever, but as a product of its time, it wasn't as icky as a lot of things. So I'm not docking it any points for the ickiness, because it's actually probably fairly progressive for its time.
Yeah. Well, and to be sure, like some of the things like the eugenics policies of the spacers and stuff aren't necessarily presented as positive.
Oh yeah, no, I meant more like women being painted as
sure.
silly and stupid and emotional. And yeah.
I think I am at like 4.5, maybe 4 to 4.5.
All right.
Maybe.
Is it just?
I liked it a lot.
Like, is it just because like some of the magic isn't there anymore for having known the killer?
No, I'm not really sure. I still really enjoyed reading it. You know, it's not a difficult read by any means, but it does like feel fairly substantial nonetheless, because there's a lot of talking about concepts and things.
Yeah, there was a lot of like really cool philosophy stuff. There was a lot of really cool pseudoscience speech, which, you know, some of which is even like based in concepts that he clearly understood. And that had actually been a question of mine, was how much of a basis of science did he actually have before he started writing? Because I was like, he talks about sciencey stuff like somebody who's done some science thinking. So
yeah, this book in particular would have been I don't know if he was still a biochem professor when he wrote this, but it was several years after he began as a biochemistry professor. So he had multiple degrees in multiple fields, including a doctorate in philosophy, as well as being a biochemistry professor at the Boston College of Medicine.
Because sometimes, as somebody with a science background, you read pseudoscience and it's like this person just like grabbed a bunch of terms they thought sounded cool and stuck them together. And this science speak was very rooted, and it felt natural and knowledgeable.
Yeah. Asimov was very privy to the sciences, and like I said, especially as his career went on, wrote a lot of nonfiction, both in the case of like textbooks and in the case of things that were more like science popularization kind of things.
Yeah.
Here's science about things in a way that is digestible by laymen or by children to like get them interested and so forth. So that was definitely a thing that he was very involved in throughout his life.
Cool. Well,
he was pals with Carl Sagan, I think.
Oh, fun.
Yeah. So, what are we reading next?
Well, since you had your first pick, this is not a book that was written for children, but I, as a child, read this. I am doing one of mine that's like that. Very different genre, though. We are finally doing the promised thing of sending some Stephen King your way. And I decided to be kind because there were a number of multiple thousand pagers I could have selected that I read first. But I picked Pet Sematary. It's a little bit of a shorter one, but also was definitely one of the ones that gave me some lasting nightmares for a little while. So
yeah, I don't know if you should have read that as a kid.
There's a lot of things I shouldn't have done as a kid.
That's fair. I haven't read any Stephen King aside from On Writing, so I'm excited.
Well, buckle up.
Yep.
And think while you're reading it, Wren read this sort of stuff as a child. That explains a lot.
It does.
No.
Spoilers. I'm like halfway through the book, and a lot of things are falling into place.
My Dog Ate My Book Report is hosted and produced by Wren and Brandon, that's us, and edited by the fabulous Derrick Valen.
The music used in this podcast was licensed by Epidemic Sound. Transcripts were generated by Otter.ai. Our icon image was illustrated by Cindy Lau.
Have a question or comment for the team?
You can find us on our website, which links to all of our socials at dogatemybookraport.blueberry.net. That's BLUBRRY.net. Or by emailing at dogatemybookraport@gmail.com.
Blueberry doesn't like vowels. But anyway, we would be super excited to know what books you loved growing up.
Thanks for listening.